One of the key components of your test-out training are the lab activities. In this demonstration, I'll show you the components of our lab simulator so that you can successfully complete the lab activities that are included as part of the course. The lab interface is divided into 4 main areas. On the right is the scenario window. The scenario describes the tasks that you are to perform during this lab. Typically, items in bullet points or otherwise described in the lab are items that you will be evaluated on and expected to perform correctly. You can close the scenario window to give you more room when working with the lab interface. Click the scenario button to reopen or to close the scenario window. The main area here is the workbench. The workbench includes those items that you will be working with and configuring. For example, we have a computer, a keyboard, a mouse, and even some wall connectors that include power and network and phone connections. On the left is the shelf. The shelf holds objects organized by categories, and these are objects that you will use to complete your configuration of objects on the bench. You can think of the shelf as the inventory that you have of spare parts, or perhaps an online ordering system where you would go to order the parts that you need to complete your configuration. The selected component window at the bottom gives you additional details about an object. For instance, if you were to select a cable, you could see the cable as well as the connectors that are on both ends of that cable. To complete a lab activity, you typically use the following process. Read the scenario to identify the task that you are required to perform. Then you might need to examine the objects on the bench. If you're working on a small screen such as this one, you can get more room on the bench by hiding the scenario, and you can also collapse the shelf. You can also modify the zoom level that exists on the bench. For example, zooming out allows you to see more objects at a time. To see more details for an object, you can zoom in and then scroll to look at the area of the object that you want to view. Each object on the bench occupies a certain space on the bench, denoted by these small outlines around the object. Buttons at the top change the view of the specific object. For example, I can toggle between the back and the front views of the computer. Some objects only have a single view. In some cases, you can rearrange objects on the bench by grabbing the object and then dragging it to its new location on the bench. You might do this to put 2 objects close to each other that you need to manage at the same time. Be aware that some objects, such as the wall plate, cannot be moved. To change the position of that object, you can simply rearrange the objects to either side of that object. Once you are familiar with what's on the bench, you would typically go next to the shelf, and you would use the categories and the objects on the shelf to select the items that are required to complete the scenario. Notice that as I select an object, the selected component window changes based on the object that I have selected. On the shelf, you can read the description or view the details of the object to get a better idea of the object that's on the shelf. For a cable such as this, you can click the detail of each connector and view one or more views of that connector. In some scenarios, you will be expected to be able to make your selection based on the appearance of an item. Before selecting the item from the shelf, view the details in the selected component window to verify that you have selected the correct object that meets your requirements. For some objects, when you select the object and view its details, there will be an additional tab called the Specifications tab. This contains a description of additional information about the object. In some cases, you may need to read the detailed specifications to find out about the object, to verify that it is the object that you need. The specifications for an object are in some cases similar to what you might find in a user manual for that object, or perhaps a detailed description that you might find online about the object before you order it. Before you can work with an object, you need to add the object to the bench or connect it to an item that already exists on the bench. For example, To add an object to the bench, I'd click on the object in the shelf and then drag it to the workbench. Notice how the area between the two objects is highlighted to identify the area where the new object will be added to the bench. Releasing the mouse on this area drops the object on the bench. Once the object is on the bench, I can switch views and work with that object. In this case, I need to connect the monitor to the computer. Let me zoom just a little bit to where I can see both the monitor and the computer ports. I'll select the cable, and then to connect the cable ends in the selected component window, I can grab the cable end that I want to use for the connection. And I can drag that connector over the port where it connects. Notice how the port itself is highlighted. Anything that is highlighted is a possible drop area, although be aware that not everything will fit. If an object will not fit, you'll be shown a message that the connector could not be connected. If you drop an object in an invalid area, simply try again at the correct location. Notice how the selected component window has changed to indicate that the connector is now connected to the video adapter, whereas the second end of the cable here is currently unconnected. And I can use the same process to connect the other end of the cable to the monitor. You can also connect cables by grabbing the cable off the shelf and simply dropping it on a drop area. You will then be shown a menu of the available connections, and you can select the connection to use. And then from the selected component window, you can work with the other connectors on that cable. Now that I have the computer connected to the monitor, I can switch to the front view of both objects and then click the power buttons on these objects to turn them on. Let's zoom in slightly to get a better view of the monitor. And here you can see the power button, and notice again how it highlights in blue. When I turn it on, I'm currently told that there is no signal being sent to the monitor. This is because the computer currently is not on. As soon as I turn the computer on, I am switched to a view that shows me what is happening on the monitor for that computer, and you'll see the computer go through its startup process, loading the BIOS and then booting into Windows. This is a simulated Windows Vista desktop. It has a start menu, and you can select items from the start menu to work with and manage the computer. For example, you can go to the control panel and choose items within the control panel to manage the configuration for this computer. Once again, the scenario will tell you the task that you are expected to perform. As you work in the simulated operating system, be aware that not everything has been enabled. If you click a link or choose an option and nothing seems to happen, try doing the task another way, or realize that the option you are trying to choose is not necessary to complete the assigned tasks. When the computer is turned on and running, you can use the available views list at the top to switch between the operating system and the hardware bench. So for instance, in some cases you may need to troubleshoot a problem in the operating system, but you may find that the cause of the problem really exists within the hardware configuration. From the hardware bench, you can also click the monitor to return to the operating system view. Let's look at a couple more tips for working with the labs. If I switch to the back view of my computer, you'll notice that there are several cables that are connected to the computer. And notice that not the entire cable is shown, so you can't trace the cable to find a connected object. To identify what is connected to the other end of this connector, simply select the cable and use the selected component window at the bottom to identify where these objects are connected. I have currently selected the female end of this AC power adapter, and I can see here the text in white telling me where the other connector is connected. For example, this cable is plugged in to the wall outlet. Scrolling over to the wall outlet, I could select a cable and then examine the details to identify where this end of the cable goes to. For instance, the bottom cable here is the cable that is connected to the computer. You'll also notice that certain objects have icons that represent the connections for that object. And these are the cables that are currently connected to the selected object. For example, the monitor currently has two cables, a power cable and the monitor cable. And I can select these objects as well to identify where the cable ends are connected. In addition to putting objects on the bench, I can also take objects that are on the bench and return them to the shelf. And I do that by simply dragging the object back to the shelf. However, be aware that before I can put an object on the shelf, I need to first disconnect it. So in this case, I could go to the back view, grab my cables, and to disconnect a cable, I simply grab the cable and drag it off of its connection area. When I release the cable end, it will now be unconnected, and I can do the same for this second connector. With both objects disconnected, I can now grab the object and drag it back to the shelf. Depending on the configuration, be aware that some objects cannot be removed from the bench, even if I happen to disconnect the object. So in this case, I will not be able to drag the keyboard off of the bench. Typically, any item I have added from the shelf to the bench, I will be able to return to the shelf. When you're finished completing all tasks described in the scenario, click the Done button to receive your score. The score report identifies how you did on each of the required tasks. In this case, I have the first 4 tasks incorrect because I disconnected these connections and returned the monitor to the shelf. However, at some point during the lab, I did successfully boot the computer. Below the task report, I have an explanation, which, among other things, will include steps that I could have taken to complete the lab successfully.